Well, ladies and gentlemen, I could just introduce our next session and our next speaker, and it's just a great delight, and given what Father Stenhouse has been going through in recent days in terms of his health, a great relief for me to be able to welcome him to today's conference and to introduce him. He is, of course, most widely known for his long-time editorship of the monthly magazine Annals Australasia, a mere half-century, 51 years to be exact, that he's been editor. So, you know, some people never really get a chance to put the hard yards in. And this coincides with the bulk of the years of his priesthood as a missionary of the Sacred Heart, as he was ordained in 1963, only 3 years before he assumed the role of editor of Annals. But he has many other strings to his bow, as some of you would certainly be aware of. First and foremost, he is a devoted priest. He's always shown extraordinary care for his people, bringing spiritual support and solace to so many fellow priests and writers, university professors and students, particularly those from overseas, parliamentarians, musicians, singers, and so on. He's an accomplished journalist, writing for the Australian and other newspapers and magazines over the years, apart, of course, from Annals. He's a noted scholar on the Middle East, an expert in Semitic cultures and languages, as well as on Middle Eastern politics and religion. He inherited his love of languages from his mother, and he's shown this love in the translations that he's produced of historical works. Furthermore, he's combined his scholarship with his journalism, serving at times as a foreign correspondent, for example, during the long-running war in Lebanon. Not for nothing was he given the moniker Priest of the Arabian Nights, because of his ability to read the Arabian Nights in the original language. Another string to the bow is he's lectured in biblical studies at Sydney University and elsewhere, and given uncountable public lectures, including here at Campion College. And speaking of Campion, he has been from the beginning a great friend and supporter of this college, and personally I would want to pay tribute to him for being a great friend and supporter of myself. He was an early member of our Campion board, and in fact our first meetings in the planning stages of Campion took place at the MSC Monastery in Kensington, where Father Paul lives and works. Most recently, the board has awarded Paul an honorary fellowship of the college, which will be conferred, we hope, at our annual graduation ceremony in December. So it's just a real thrill, wonderful delight and privilege to welcome him and to ask him to speak on John Farrell.
Thank you, Carl. My voice, unfortunately, has decided to leave me. It probably feels that it's been overused. Oh, mamma mia, what am I doing? Oh, all right, thank you. I feel a bit like the ghost of Banquo. I can imagine how he must have felt. Can everybody hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
You can hear me, can you?
Yes.
Oh, well, all right. I won't have to elevate my voice much more, but it is a bit of a problem. I want to say something about John Farrell. John Farrell has been completely forgotten. And he was not only one of the great poets of this country, he was a social reformer, he was a journalist, he was a brewer. It sounds like I've been partaking of whatever he brewed. But anyway, I wanted to say something about John Farrell, and I had I was very tempted just to talk about him as a poet, because his poetry is absolutely wonderful. But I decided that it might be better to say something about him as a single taxer, because he was the head of the land nationalisers and the single taxers. And these have been all forgotten as well with John Farrell. They've all gone down the gurgler. So, and John Farrell is important because, in fact, the Labour Party would never have come into existence if John Farrell hadn't spent years pushing for salaries for politicians, for parliamentarians. Parliament was the exclusive zone of landowners and landlords, and the working people really could never get in there because they couldn't survive. There would be no income. Anyway, he pushed and pushed, and eventually he got it through. And the Labour Party would never have come into existence if it hadn't been for the cells of the single taxers and the land nationalisers. In the country districts of Australia, they were extraordinarily loyal to the single tax idea. In other words, a tax on land, not a tax on salary. Farrell said on one occasion, well, he wrote, he said nothing. He would never talk, and actually I think he was right. It's much better not to talk. I have to say, excuse me, my complaints and everything, they rather, if I get too caught up in what I'm saying, I'm just as likely to burst into tears, which I find quite embarrassing. But anyway, if you can put up with it, the single tax was an extraordinarily important element in the early history of this country's political life. And I'd like to say something about that. So, can I just go back a little bit before that and tell you who John Farrell was and how I got to hear about him? I'd heard first of Mary Cameron, later Dame Mary Gilmore, before I even knew that John Farrell existed. In 1915, 11 years after the 53-year-old Farrell had died, when my mother was 12, a remittance man, a regular visitor to her home at Matavoy, at Cobbitty in New South Wales, not far from here, and a tramp without a home, he knew that for whatever reason he wasn't going to be going back to Cobbitty. So he told the little girl to keep for herself his copies of The Worker that were delivered regularly to Matavoy, and advised her to read Mary Gilmore's writings carefully. This she did, and her respect for Mary Gilmore was passed on to me. I should say, when I talk about Mary Gilmore, that I'm not unaware that Mary Gilmore, her reputation as a writer, has suffered rather badly over the years since her death. But I don't want to discuss that now. But I think that it's extremely unfair. And anyway, in 1905, a year after John Farrell's death, Frank Sheed, founder with his wife Maisie Ward of the well-known publishing house Sheed and Ward, he was 8 years old in 1905. He bought his father a copy of Hits, Skits and Jingles by W.T. Googe. His father showed it to a friend who called it pleasant doggerel. His father never looked at it again. But young Sheed loved it, and well into his 80s, he would recite for me poem after poem with relish. He used to say that he learnt more about writing from Googe's verse than from any other book. And if I can recommend if you can get a copy of Hits, Skits and Jingles, you'll be astonished at what this young Englishman managed to write in a place called, well anyway, it'll come to me in a minute, out of Lithgow. Googe is virtually unknown now, as is Farrell, his journalistic godfather. It was from Frank Sheed that I first learned that Farrell had helped Googe when the struggling English immigrant was looking for work as a journalist around Sunny Corner, that's the place. I visited Sunny Corner once, there's nothing there. And when I say nothing, there is nothing. There is not a single house. There's no sign that anybody ever had a little township there. But anyway, John Farrell ran a newspaper from Lithgow called the Lithgow Enterprise and Sunny Corner Advocate. But for Sunny Corner, unlike Lithgow, it doesn't exist anymore. In a letter drafted on January the 21st in 1951, Dame Mary Gilmore suggested that an anthem written by the poet John Farrell for the inauguration of the Australian Commonwealth 50 years before should be reproduced for use during the Jubilee. And she added, "It will be remembered that John Farrell was one of the important poets of his day." The anthem in question, Hymn of the Commonwealth, sung by an adult chorus of 1,000 voices on Inauguration Day in Centennial Park, prays in the fourth and last stanza, ordain that as brothers we live in the sun and light of Australia, with nationhood one, just, kind, as no others before us have done, forevermore. History must decide with what justice and kindness the Commonwealth has distinguished itself since Federation. But Mary Gilmore's artless expectation that Farrell would be remembered has remained almost entirely unfulfilled. For Farrell remained a mystery, even to those who loved him. He never sought the glare of footlights, constantly withdrew himself into obscurity. He enjoyed the anonymity, first as contributing poet to various country newspapers, the Bulletin, newly born in 1880, which incidentally, as some may know, but I didn't until I started looking into it, that the Bulletin was printed for quite some time by the Freeman's Journal, which was the ancestor of the Catholic Weekly, which probably now, if it really appreciates the fact, is one of the oldest, after the Sydney Morning Herald and a couple of other publications, one of the very oldest newspapers in the country, if you start with the Freeman's Journal, which I think started about 1850. Were it not, then he became editor and owner of a number of newspapers and journals, and finally as editor-in-chief and leading writer for the Sydney Daily Telegraph, which used to be in King Street and was a broadsheet. He was editor for about a year, or for less than a year, but he discovered that the editor's desk was made of the same wood as the advertising manager's desk. In other words, there were restrictions on what he was allowed to pass through the paper. Well, he gave up a job on £1,000 a year. And in 1880, I think you'd probably find that the average wage would have been about £2 or £3. Not very much. But anyway, were it not for the unanimous respect and admiration his contemporaries had for John Farrell as a poet, reformer, patron of young writers, journalist, and friend, we would be tempted to leave him in anonymity. But his story is too inextricably bound up with that of significant contemporaries, many of whom shared his fate, for it to be left untold, and the oblivion in which he languished for more than 115 years was not willed by the public who loved him. Farrell is the hidden element, the X factor in so many areas of Australian life in the latter half of the 19th century that the silence surrounding his life and work becomes all the more extraordinary. W.H.O. Smeaton, in 1888, writing of Australian poetry in the Centennial magazine, compared Farrell's verse with that of Brunton Stevens, Henry Kendall, and Adam Lindsay Gordon. Farrell was the literary godfather of William Googe. He was the idol of young Henry Lawson, the close friend of Victor Daly, William B. Daly, Francis Adams, Roderick Quinn, Banjo Patterson, Mary Cameron, Edward Dyson, Edwin Brady, Sidney Jeffcott, and many others whose contributions, like Farrell's, have generally been overlooked in any studies of this period, which I find extraordinary. Farrell's influence on politics, and especially his relationship to the early Labor Party, his friendship with and influence on the young William Morris Hughes, Frank Cotton and William Holman, and his lifelong espousal of the single tax and land nationalisation cause, and his success in getting a salary for parliamentarians, all had an important bearing on land reform and political initiatives whose effects are still being felt today. But of course, unfortunately, the parliamentarians decided that in addition to that, all the land tax was a very good idea, but they just included it with salary tax, which seemed to me to be a bit ironic, that all the effort he put into proving how important it was to tax, especially land which wasn't being developed, all that happened was they adopted it, but they wouldn't get rid of salaries on income tax on salaries. Farrell's name is closely linked with those of W.G. Spence and William Lane in the history of Australian socialist literature and thought. Alongside Catherine Spence, and to a lesser extent Rose Scott, he stands out as a significant figure among 19th century utopians. The picture which W.E. Fitzhenry paints of the bench at the Bulletin, where contributors used to wait upon the good pleasure of Tom McMahon, the accountant. Everybody who wrote for the Bulletin used to have to turn up there. Perhaps they used to send it if you lived outside of Sydney, but anyway, they'd turn up there and they'd all sit at a bench and be paid. But anyway, I'm sure that Rupert Murdoch thought of the idea, but it mightn't work these days. But anyway, the picture which Fitzhenry paints of the bench depicts some of the greats in the literary world of pre-Federation Australia. On the bench, Louis Beck, home from the South Seas, often had a pleasant snooze, and Ernest Favens and the poet John Farrell swapped many a yarn. From the old bench, Harry Morant, the breaker, said goodbye to a host of bohemian friends before his departure to the South African War. And Phil May, 1 foot resting on the bench, is said to have modelled the comical caricature of himself, which he labelled, "That's me when I'm old." And on the bench, Rod Quinn smiled at Hugh McRae, who roared with wild laughter at Rod's gentle humour. Or Fred Broomfield boomed the literature of the world to anyone who would listen to him. Names that are forgotten now, said Fitzhenry, sat on the bench awaiting a cheque from Tom McMahon. P.T. Freeman, Steve O'Brien, Perce Abbott, Stefan von Kotz, Archibald Preston and Philip Holdsworth. The names are probably unfamiliar to you, but they were once filling the literature, the books, the newspapers of the day. In the opinion of his peers on the bench, John Farrell wasn't built to standard as a bush balladist, as a poet, as a journalist and a social reformer. He'd been born in 1851 or 1852, there's some uncertainty about the date, in Buenos Aires. Actually, it wasn't Buenos Aires, I meant to say correctly, it was actually Rosario, up the river Pirana, a few hundred k's from Buenos Aires, in the then Federation of Argentina, better known today simply as Argentina. I'm sorry, but I find this thing very obstructive, but anyway, can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Oh, no, it's all right. Don't worry, Carl. It's just if it's a bit lower, it might be better. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. It's just that I go a bit cross-eyed trying to read through the technology. It's all baffling me a bit. Anyway, when next we meet Farrell, he is editor of The Telegraph, a broadsheet printed in King Street, and compulsively obsessed with the single taxes and the land nationalisers. Now I'd like to say something now, and I hope you won't all go to sleep. Are you going to sleep? All right. You are allowed to, by the way. As a matter of fact, if you tape a recording of this, you can probably play it to yourself at night. But now, I mean, personally, I find this whole political situation an enormous mess. But I've tried to disentangle it as best I could. So this is Farrell, the single tax, and I chose to talk about the Labor Party because there are many myths about the Labor Party and the Catholic Church and Catholic politicians, which I think you may find some light cast upon as I go on, as if I can ever get through this. Among the early single taxers who owed their start in politics to Farrell, and upon whom his influence rested long after his death, were Joseph Cook, Frank Cotton, William Morris Hughes, William Arthur Holman, George Beebe, Walter Johnson, George Black, John Haynes, R. Hollis, and William Affleck. As well, many of the free traders who voted with the Labor members or were themselves elected on a Labor ticket were so well disposed to Labor because of the writings of Farrell and the efforts of other single taxers. The vagaries of their political careers never affected their friendship with Farrell. All were foundation members of the Labor Party, as were numbers of other single taxers who, like Farrell, never entered Parliament. Cook and Hughes would have become Prime Ministers of the Commonwealth. Walter Elliott Johnson would be a Cabinet Minister in the first Commonwealth Parliament. Holman would be a New South Wales Premier. Holman, Hughes, Beebe, Black and others abandoned their single tax positions sooner, like Holman, Black and Beebe, or later like Hughes. But its influence over them was profound. Hughes, Holman and Beebe had been won over to the single tax during Henry George's barnstorming tour in 1890, and Hughes admitted that it had an abiding influence on his thought as on that of the Labor Party as a whole. Along with Cotton, Holman and Beebe, Hughes was a member of the Balmain Single Tax League, and his first published work was a long letter to the editor of the Democrat when Farrell was editing it. It was largely due to Farrell's prompting that Hughes wrote the brilliant series of articles which appeared in the Telegraph presenting the case for Labor in the early part of the century. According to Farmer White, that John Farrell and William Hughes should find themselves on common ground was in the natural order of things. Farrell, through his position on the Daily Telegraph, was to provide Hughes with a friend at court long after Hughes had abandoned strict single tax ideas. Holman, like Hughes, a Londoner, had come to Australia in 1888 and had been introduced to politics through the single tax. He worked with Farrell on the Daily Telegraph when the latter was editor. On one occasion, young Holman, who would enter Parliament that year, called to see Farrell and found him busy. Apologising for interrupting, Holman turned to leave, and the editor brushed aside his apologies. "Don't worry," he said, "I was only writing a leader." When Holman said he thought that would be a task of responsibility and strain, Farrell replied ambiguously, "Not at all. If a man knows a lot about a subject or nothing at all, it makes no difference. It comes easy." Well, you know, when he died, one of his poet friends said that he spent his whole life writing articles of no concern or interest to anybody. And I think that that's the fate of all of us. Of that distinguished group, Farrell alone held himself aloof from the parliamentary arena, despite his being offered the seat of Albury by the residents who regarded him as one of their own. He was never seriously tempted, not because he felt that nothing matters anyhow, as George Black suggested, but because he knew that his power lay in his pen and not in public speaking. And I suspect that should be the same with me. I should have thought of that before I got here. I'm afraid you're being, what you see is a pale reflection of my former self. And we suspect also, because it amused him to be an éminence grise to the bunyip courts of Parkes, Dibbs and Reid, who were premiers of New South Wales, and their bunyip courts, which played up to the bunyipocracy around the place. He thought that it was interesting that he was there sort of hidden in the dark somewhere, having an influence, trying to anyway. The Parliamentary Labor Party came into being in the euphoria of the final returns of July 4, 1891. Of the 35 members of the Labor members returned, 18 were protectionist, and one of these, Hutchison, was at least sympathetic to the single tax. 17 were free traders, and 9 of these were single taxes. I should say that Labor members were elected on a platform of single tax and free trade. Now, protectionists were very strong in New South Wales and in Australia at that time, because protectionism was something that the landowners favoured, and they seemed to have extraordinary influence. But anyway, as we come to consider the new party and its relationship to Farrell and the single taxes, some premises need to be established. 1. The early New South Wales single taxes, including all those who formed a nucleus of Labor men in the 1891 Parliament, were not opposed to trade unionism. All the latter, with the exception of Dr. Hollis and George Black, were trade unionists, and some, like Cotton, represented trade unions in the Trade Union Council. I should say also that at the time of this 1891 election, it was after the maritime strike, the terrible maritime strike, and the Barcaldine shearers strike, which were part of the 1889-90 phenomenon. And the trade unions didn't put in much of a good performance for their members. And by and large, it was considered that the trade unions were ineffectual. And it's curious, I mean, I think that you could say truly that the Labour Party came into being because people were disillusioned with trade unionism. And there's a lot of truth in that. Bede Nairn, in his Civilising Capitalism and the Labour Movement in New South Wales, 1870 to 1900, deplores the fact that Frank Cotton's trade unionism was limited, ideologically flawed by Georgism, single tax that is, and hence suspect on the Trades and Labour Council. And this does less than justice to Cotton and reflects a mentality stoutly protectionist. To charges in the Australian Workman, then edited by a young poet friend of Farrell's, Edwin Brady, and by E.W. O'Sullivan, an old friend, really, I would think, who had a great influence on Farrell and who certainly changed him from a protectionist to a free trader. E.W. O'Sullivan, among others, that single tax was opposed by trade unionists in America. Farrell replied that in 1891 the biggest trade union organisation in the US, the Knights of Labour, placed the single tax prominently on their platform and declared protection to be a fraud. Up to June 11, 1893, over 780 branches of US unions had expressed adherence to the single tax theory. The secretary of the TLC, J. Riddle, denounced by the workmen as a non-bona fide working man, was himself a single taxer. But you'll notice that Edwin Brady, who was actually a friend of Farrell's, was holding a strong opinion contrary to his. And the extraordinary thing about Farrell was that no matter who differed from him, he never ever let it affect his friendship for these people. And I think we could well learn a lesson from that. Secondly, despite claims that none of the fiscal groups or single taxes or socialists had a framework of rural support to compare with the Bush auxiliaries of the Trades and Labour Council, we find that by September 17, 1891, the TLC had recognised 18 Labour electoral leagues, of which 15 were in the city, and 3 in the country. While in July 1890, there were 7 city single tax leagues and 24 in the country. And the phenomenon of the single tax was that it was in the country that people really appreciated how important it was, but city people found it less so. The Bush base of the single tax leagues was its strength, and the electoral leagues set up by the TLC after the debacle of the 1890-91 strikes were in many cases grafted onto an already existing single tax league body. Now, thirdly, it is an oversimplification to claim that the single taxes had been invited into the Labour Party, but had to be kept in their place, fixed by their minority status, no matter how useful their ideas. The single taxes welcomed proposals to set up a Labour Party. They stumped around the country and the city electorates. They joined the Labour electoral leagues. They made all their cells available to those who wanted to join the Labour Party. And when their loyalty was tested in October 1891, we find that the 17 who remained faithful to their pledges, that is, single tax and free trade, out of the original 35 members, included all the original single taxes. All the original people who were single tax supporters remained faithful to those pledges, but unfortunately the rest didn't. It's not difficult to write history with hindsight, in the light of the eventual submission of the Parliamentary Labour Party to the TLC, in other words, the party's submission to the Trade and Labour Council. In fact, the Trades and Labour Council had been doing very little during the strike, both those strikes. But for some reason or another, anyway, the party submitted to it, and the latter's being swallowed up by the Australian Labour Federation in 1894, it was only a question of time before single taxes and socialists were excluded from the party by the fervently protectionist trade unions, which had been trying since 1891 to bring the independent Labour parliamentarians to heel. The demise of the single taxes spelled the end of a truly independent and democratic political arm of the working classes. By 1896, the party was under the firm control of the AWU, that was Spence, W.G. Spence, and the LEL, that was the Labour Electoral League, F. Flowers, and the LEL was asserting its authority over the ALF. During the negotiations that led up to the absorption of the TLC by the ALF, J. Woodcock commented that the deplorable condition of labour today was the result of unions interfering in politics. Without the single taxes and the socialists, however, the electoral leagues would have been toothless tigers, if they could have come into being at all. The Parliamentary Labour Party was less a creature of the trade union movement than a product of idealistic unionists and non-unionists disillusioned with ineffectual union industrial action. What was to become, you all still awake more or less, I'm sorry. A friend, Michael Wilding, he said, for goodness sake, don't talk. He said, don't talk about the single tax. I'm afraid he was right. I mean, not only was it unpopular, as you can imagine, to the landlords and the landowners, but it's still unpopular. Now let me see what I can leave out of all this. The results of the 1894 election proved Farrell right. Well, I better give you the first part. What was to become the platform of the first Parliamentary Labour Party was drawn up by 3 trade unionists, one of whom, Frank Cotton, was a dedicated single taxer, while the other 2, T.J. Horton and R. Boxall, were protectionists. Cotton was assisting Farrell at this time to edit The Democrat. The fact that almost all the planks of the single taxes were included among it, finally approved by the TLC, is not merely a tribute to Cotton's powers of persuasion, but to the fact that many of the delegates were themselves convinced single taxes. Even Horton commented to the Star that some of the strongest protectionists on the council voted for the land taxation plank, and added that the adoption of the plank points to the majority being land taxes, in other words, single taxes. Horton, the protectionist, was actually defending Cotton and Labour unity against attacks in the Star, which was the organ of protection. Well, nobody's heard of the Star either. I mean, I'm reading out the names of newspapers, and they're not the types of names that you've even heard before, but it's a pity. The results of the 1894 election proved Farrell right. Whereas in 1891 Labor had gained 19 rural seats, 4 city seats and 11 suburban seats, for a total of 34, so 19 rural, 4 city and 11 suburban, for a total of 34. In 1894, Labor could win only 10 rural seats, 10, 2 city seats and 3 suburban seats, for a total of 15. From being almost 25% of the House in 1891, Labor fell to a disappointing 12%. And I think it can be unequivocally stated that that fall was entirely due to Labor's abandonment of single tax and free trade. The defeat of Labor was also a setback for the single taxes and the socialists among the Labor supporters who'd held out high hopes for the party as a reforming body. Farrell, in the Single Tax, which is a paper, found nevertheless hopeful signs in the presence in Parliament today of a large number of strong advocates of land value taxation. In the leading place this principle occupies in the platform of organised labour and in the definite resistance offered to it by monopolists. He felt, however, that there was a reason to fear that tariff reform would be delayed and that when land value taxation was finally imposed, it would be vitiated by exceptions. Now, the new Labor Party of 15 members was made up mainly of unionists, except for Law, Griffith and Hughes. Do you know how many Catholics there were in the first Labor Party? They had 35 members. Anybody got any idea? There were 5. There were only 5 Catholics: J.D. Fitzgerald, G.F. Hutchinson, A.J. Kelly, J. Worgan and J. Newton. There was none in the party of 1894. There were 5 in the first one and none in the second. The first Catholic Labor politician of note was not elected until 1895. Would anybody know who he would be?
Daly?
No, sorry. Any other suggestions? Sorry, it's not a trick question, but it is an impossible one. Thank you for trying, to the lady in the 5th seat down there. His name was John Rowland Dacey, after whom Daceyville is named in Sydney. Daceyville, a protectionist. He was the only Labor candidate in that election who defeated a Reed free trader. As an employer and not a manual worker, Dacey, and he was a Catholic, Dacey's views were much influenced by Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum. And I must say, at every opportunity, he quoted it. Dacey showed that the Parliamentary Labor Party was not the exclusive domain of Protestants and radical socialists. Cook, Farrell's Lithgow protege, was appointed Postmaster General by Reed, thereby becoming the first Labor minister in any Australian government. This mollified, and I wonder who remembers that now, but Cook was the man. This mollified the 6 single taxes and the 3 other free traders among the non-solidarity Labor members, but drew fire from the official Labor members who had run their own candidate against Cook when he came up for ministerial re-election. This may, however, have been more a blow for protection than against the non-solidarity member. I think I can leave some of that out. Let me just see here. Farrell's political writing continued right up till his death. On January the 8th, 1904, He had long known the truth that fire-eating W.J. Ferguson, a leader of the 1892 Broken Hill strike, expressed at a gathering in 1897 to farewell British Labour leader Ben Tillett. The man who comes forward to fight the workers' battles will find his bitterest opponents among the men he's fighting for. And I think that many have found that that was true. For all that, Farrell never became cynical, was a friend to everybody, even to those who abandoned his ideals and left him for the Macquarie Street bear garden. And the £300 a year he had fought so hard to win for them. I mean, £300 a year in 1891 was an awful lot of money. I mean, you've no idea what you could do with it. You could go back to England for 10 shillings steerage or something. You know, it's a lot of money. And then for them to be arguing, not so much for what was for the good of the country, but what was for the good of the party, what was for the good of their particular sect in the party. It's still going on all the time. Whenever a history of the single tax leagues comes to be written, or when a complete history of the Labour Party, the trades union movement after 1887, or of the economic history of Australia, if ever it comes to be rewritten, the writings of Farrell and his fellow single taxers should be taken into account. However much one may differ from Picard in his assessment of the reasons and methods underlying the policies of the single taxes, we can agree with him that the weight of historical evidence seems sufficient to substantiate the original thesis that the single taxes were among the forefront in the organisation of political labour in New South Wales, and that their influence was great enough to secure for them, however briefly, control of the party executive, many of the branches, and a solid core of single tax parliamentarians able to force concessions from both the older parties. And I really defy anybody to find very many references to single tax or to any of the single taxes whom I've mentioned if you look in histories of the Labour Party. They tend to be dismissed. And I hope that despite all my banquo-ish going on up here, that at least you could grant that there was some merit in the claim that these poor men who devoted their lives to promoting a single tax on land, and as I think I said, Farrell thought that, did I tell you what he said? He said that he thought that putting a tax on a working man's salary was like penalising the Duke of Wellington for winning the Battle of Waterloo. Instead of putting him on a statue, putting a statue of him, on a column in London, they should have really charged him something. And however much that might seem like an extreme analogy, I think you'd have to grant that taking from a man what he earned by the sweat of his brow and saying that the government has a right to it, when in fact all that the government has a right to is this country, the land. It's got a right to the land, but does it have a right to your income, to dip into it? I don't want to start a revolution. I'd hate it to be said that, like the people in Barcelona, people stormed out of Campion College. Opposing income tax. Oh, dear me. Now, where am I? The original Labour Party, a party of individuals, of idealists, came into being as a result of the influence and energies of radicals like Farrell and the single taxes, at a time when caucus and pledges were still to make their meaning plain and their presence felt. The single tax failed to achieve its early promise because it was too slow a vehicle of reform. Moreover, it was closely tied in with the fortunes of free trade, which was largely misunderstood in this country. Some single taxes appeared to be too emotional. I'm getting that way myself. And too radical. These frightened away many intellectuals and professional economists, without whose backing no movement could survive for very long. In other words, the people promoting it were largely the people who stood to benefit from it. They were people who felt it in their heart. They were very emotionally involved with it, and they were probably too emotionally involved with it. As a result, they just frightened everybody else away. And they, instead of examining it intellectually and looking at George's theories a little objectively, they didn't do so. A further and more serious problem was the alienation of many working class people who feared unlimited competition from outside the country or from inside the country. These believed the propaganda of the establishment press, which painted the single taxes as socialists and anarchists, as enemies of law and order, and ultimately of the real interests of the working class. Farrell's refusal to allow reactions to advertisers to dictate editorial policy. I mentioned that before when I said he gave up his job as editor of the Telegraph. But every newspaper he ever ran went broke. And I've got to tell you that I'm definitely following in his footsteps. Because the Annals went broke too. Yes, a great pity. But nevertheless, I suppose we have to move on. But Farrell could never work out. He wasn't interested in what the readers wanted. He was only interested in printing in all the newspapers. He must have edited 7 or 8 newspapers of one kind or another, and including the Telegraph. And he was forever promoting a single tax and the land nationalisers principles. And as a result, they just lost readers. I expected half of you to have gone. I thought by now Michael's warning could well have been proven true. Farrell's refusal to allow reactions of advertisers to dictate editorial policy with its inevitable financially disastrous consequences was paralleled by his stubborn idealism in the economic and social areas. If, despite years of attempting to educate them, his fellow workers couldn't or wouldn't think, then Farrell, regretfully and without acrimony, was prepared to go it alone, with predictable results. Writing in the Sunday Sun and Guardian in 1932, Tom Courtney, who was Farrell's fellow leader writer on the Daily Telegraph after he gave up editing it, much to the relief of the advertisers. In the heady days from 1890 to 1903, found himself in the press gallery of the New South Wales State Parliament. After imagining the ghosts of Parkes, Barton, Reid, McGowan, Crick, O'Sullivan and the rest carrying on a spectral wrangle in an unintelligible babble, he looked up to the gallery and he saw the ghost of John Farrell looking down on him, tinged with disappointment in its big, grey, dreamy eyes. For John had all their enthusiasm as a social reconstructor, but he believed that they were working on the wrong plan. As their enthusiasms vanish, I can see their ghosts rising in various big positions in the world of materialistic conservatism. But Farrell never changed. It was not he who was the wobbler. When the Labor Party abandoned the platform of single tax and free trade, Farrell wrote an editorial in the Telegraph and he called them wobblers. Well, he never wobbled. Sidney Jeffcott, writing of his beloved friend and mentor from the Snowy Mountains, expressed better than most the fire and the light, the ephemeral and the perennial that was of the essence of Farrell. Old mate, the night o'ertook you early. He was only 53 when he died. Death's sudden moon arose. Beside the fire you lit, I linger and watch your still repose. The firelight lengthens through the forest, the moonlight columns vast that lift the dreaded dispeopled city, the all-abandoned past. Ah, piteous light, all life's endeavour, a little space we see, immersed in death's pervading spirit, this moonlight memory. And that's it. You'll have to forgive me, I fear. I'm becoming a bit lachrymose.
Make a seat there, Father. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been wonderful to have Father Stenhouse here with us. His uncertain health has simply not been a barrier to his appearance. It's been a triumph of willpower and I think divine grace over physical capacity. But to be able to shed for us a serious and informed light on a very neglected corner of Australian history and something that was very much at the foundation of our emergence as a nation, particularly in New South Wales, and to provide us with, I think, an inspiring model who wouldn't be known to very many of us at all, myself included, John Farrell. So I think we're very much indebted to Father Stenhouse for that, as for so much else. So please join me in thanking him again.